was difficult, especially moving into Graceland. He already had his inner circle, and of course they embraced me, but I never realized that was it. I mean, he didn't really go out. We truly lived in a bubble.
August 16th, 1977. The king of rock and roll is dead, and within hours, the machinery of grief begins its grotesque work. Flowers arrive by the truckload. Fans collapse outside Graceland's gates. The world mourns in unison, united in the belief that they've lost someone irreplaceable. But there's another story happening behind those mansion walls, one that nobody outside a very small circle will understand for weeks. One that involves a woman who thought she owned a piece of forever and was about to discover she owned nothing at all. Priscilla Presley is 32 years old when she gets the call. She's not at Graceland. She's living her own life now, separate, independent in ways she never imagined possible when she was the teenage girl Elvis plucked from Germany and remade in his image. Their marriage ended 5 years earlier, officially divorced in 1972, but Priscilla had spent those intervening years convincing herself of a fundamental truth: she would always be taken care of. Not because Elvis loved her anymore, that had died long ago in their relationship, but because she was Lisa Marie's mother. Because she'd given him the best years of her life. Because no matter what happened between them romantically, there was an unspoken contract between two people who'd been bound together at the most impossible moment of his fame. But contracts, as it turns out, can be rewritten. And Elvis, in his final months, had done exactly that. The will reading happens in the offices of Elvis's attorneys in Memphis, a gray, fluorescent space that smells like old leather and older money. Priscilla sits across from men in suits who are carefully avoiding eye contact with her. She's brought her own lawyer, someone who understands that being an ex-wife to the most famous musician in history means you need to be ready for anything. But nothing could have prepared her for this. Nothing could have prepared anyone. The lawyer reading the will speaks in that particular monotone, reserved for delivering devastating news. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, receives significant portions of the estate. The Memphis Mafia, the inner circle of friends and employees who've lived off Elvis's generosity for decades, are taken care of with cash bequests and ongoing employment guarantees. Lisa Marie, Elvis's only child, is the primary beneficiary, which makes perfect sense to anyone listening. She's 9 years old. She's innocent. She deserves the kingdom her father built. But Priscilla, the woman who'd spent 14 years of her life married to Elvis Presley, the woman who'd given birth to his only heir, the woman who'd stood beside him through his comeback, his decline, his pharmaceutical spiral, Priscilla, receives nothing. Not the mansion, not the investments, not a percentage of his publishing rights, not even a symbolic piece of his legacy. The will is designed with such precision that it's impossible to read it as an accident. This wasn't an oversight. This was architecture. When it sinks in, really sinks in, Priscilla's first instinct is to rationalize. Surely there's an explanation. Surely Elvis meant to amend it. Surely this was a draft, an old version, something from before they'd worked things out or before he'd thought better of it. But the dates don't support that narrative. The will had been reviewed recently. Elvis had signed it with full awareness of what it contained. He'd made amendments just months before his death, refining it, clarifying it, making sure there were no loopholes for her to slip through. The lawyer presents another document, Elvis's personal notes about the will, written in his own hand, attempting to explain his reasoning. And there it is, the knife twist that makes everything worse. Elvis had written that he was disinheriting Priscilla not out of oversight, but out of deliberate choice. The wording is vague, but pointed. It references past conduct and fundamental breaches of trust. It mentions her attempts to exert control over my affairs and my person. It's the kind of language that suggests not a simple divorce disagreement, but a profound betrayal, the kind that a man would carry to his grave. Priscilla leaves that attorney's office in a state of shock that will take her weeks to process into something she can actually articulate. She's been erased. not just removed from the will, but actively excluded. The distinction matters. It means Elvis had thought about her. He'd considered what he was doing, and he'd decided she deserved nothing. The public doesn't immediately understand the significance of this moment. When news of the will becomes public knowledge in the days and weeks following Elvis's death, most people accept the narrative that it makes sense Lisa Marie gets the bulk of the estate, Vernon is taken care of, and the Memphis Mafia receives their payments. It seems reasonable, almost kind in its distribution. But anyone who knew Priscilla, anyone who'd followed Elvis's life closely, understood what had really happened. They understood that this was a message. A final statement from a man who couldn't say it to her face because he was already gone. And what made it even more devastating was that Priscilla actually tried to fight it. She hired attorneys. She filed challenges claiming Elvis was mentally incompetent at the time he'd signed the will. She argued that her rights as the mother of his child should grant her some claim to his legacy. But every legal avenue she pursued led to a dead end. Sometimes literally running into walls of silence from people in Elvis's inner circle who refused to testify about his mental state, his reasoning, or the conversations they'd had with him about Priscilla in those final months. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. The will was airtight. The intent was unmistakable. And what nobody could explain, not publicly anyway, was the real reason behind it. Why would a man completely erase the woman who'd borne his child? What had happened between them that was so catastrophic, so unforgivable in Elvis's mind, that he couldn't even allow her a symbolic piece of his empire? The answer to that question would take years to uncover. It would require looking back into the decade they'd spent apart, into the business dealings they'd conducted, into the personal betrayals that happened when nobody was watching. It would require understanding that Priscilla hadn't just been his wife, she'd been someone Elvis believed had betrayed him in ways that cut far deeper than infidelity or simple incompatibility. And in his final months, as his mind became increasingly clear about what mattered and what didn't, Elvis had made a choice that would echo through her life forever. To understand why Elvis erased Priscilla from his will, you have to go back to 1972, the year their marriage officially ended. But the real story doesn't begin with divorce papers or lawyers. It begins with a simple truth that nobody wanted to admit. They had already stopped being a couple years before they made it legal. The woman Elvis had married in 1967, full of hope and the desperate belief that love could survive even the machinery of Hollywood, had transformed into someone he no longer recognized. And worse, from Elvis's perspective, she'd become someone he believed was actively working against him. The early 70s are glossed over in most Elvis biographies. People talk about his Vegas performances, his comeback special in '68, the albums he recorded. What they don't talk about is the psychological warfare happening behind closed doors at Graceland. By 1970, Priscilla had stopped being the dutiful wife who existed in Elvis's shadow. She'd discovered independence, confidence, and most troubling to Elvis, she'd developed her own opinions about how his life should be managed. She started questioning his choices. She challenged his doctors about the medications they were prescribing. She suggested that his managers were taking advantage of him, that Colonel Parker's deals weren't in his best interest, that the people surrounding him weren't always acting out of love. From one perspective, Priscilla was trying to save him. From Elvis's perspective, she was trying to control him. The turning point came in 1971 when Priscilla discovered something that would fundamentally alter how Elvis saw her. She'd been going through financial documents not secretively, not out of paranoia, but as part of her responsibility managing household expenses when she uncovered a series of business dealings that Vernon and Colonel Parker had kept hidden from Elvis. These weren't small transactions. There were major agreements that affected Elvis's future earnings, his publishing rights, his creative control over his own work. When Priscilla brought this information to Elvis, expecting gratitude for protecting his interests, she got something entirely different. She got rage. Elvis didn't see her as a protector. He saw her as someone who'd been snooping through his private affairs, someone who was trying to position herself as his business advisor, someone who wanted power over his empire. The fact that she'd been right that Parker and Vernon were indeed making deals that weren't entirely in his favor made it worse, not better. Because it meant she had leverage. It meant she could hold this information over his head. It meant she'd cross from being his wife into being something more dangerous, someone who understood his vulnerabilities and could exploit them. The arguments that followed were unlike anything their marriage had seen before. Elvis accused her of being ambitious, of marrying him not for love, but for access to his wealth and influence. He reminded her of where she'd come from, a military dependent in Germany, and where she was now a woman who'd built an entire identity on being Mrs. Elvis Presley. He questioned whether she'd ever loved him at all, or if she'd simply been a very patient, very strategic gold digger. The words were designed to wound, and they did. But what they also did was establish a new dynamic in their relationship: fundamental distrust. Priscilla's response was to pull back, to stop trying to help, to stop involving herself in his business affairs. But Elvis interpreted this withdrawal as confirmation of his suspicions. If she wasn't trying to help him anymore, it was because she'd gotten what she wanted and didn't need to maintain the facade anymore. The logic was circular and paranoid, but it was how Elvis was beginning to think about the woman he'd married. By 1972, when they formally separated, the emotional distance had become complete. But it was what happened during their divorce proceedings that truly poisoned any remaining goodwill between them. Priscilla hired aggressive attorneys who fought for every advantage they could get for her and Lisa Marie. This was standard divorce procedure, nothing unusual by any measurement of normal conflict. But Elvis experienced it as a betrayal of the highest order. He'd taken care of her. He'd made her. He'd given her everything. And now she was fighting him in court, trying to extract as much money from him as possible, trying to leverage custody of their daughter as a bargaining chip. What Elvis didn't fully understand, or perhaps refused to understand, was that Priscilla was doing what any reasonable person would do in her position. She was protecting herself and her child's future. She had no career to fall back on. Her entire identity had been constructed around being Elvis's wife. And now that identity was dissolving, she had to fight for financial security because nobody was going to hand it to her simply because she'd been loyal. But Elvis saw it as greed. He saw it as proof that everything he'd suspected was true. She'd used him. She'd played the role of devoted wife perfectly until she could extract maximum value from the relationship. And now that the marriage was over, she was showing her true face. The relationship between them deteriorated into something toxic and performative. They had to see each other because of Lisa Marie. They had to communicate about custody and visitation, but every interaction became laden with subtext, with accusations, with the weight of broken promises and perceived betrayals. Elvis would make snide comments about Priscilla's new life, her dating, her attempts to rebuild herself as something other than his ex-wife. Priscilla would respond with coldness that only confirmed his belief that she'd never truly cared about him. And then, in 1973, Priscilla made a choice that Elvis would never forgive. She started dating Mike Stone, a karate instructor who taught Lisa Marie. To Elvis, this wasn't simply infidelity, it was the ultimate humiliation. It was Priscilla choosing to be with another man while still collecting alimony from him, while still using his name, while still benefiting from his wealth. It was her publicly demonstrating that she'd moved on, that he hadn't been irreplaceable, that their marriage had meant so little to her that she could replace him within months. The fact that Elvis had his own affairs, that he'd been pursuing other women since before the divorce was finalized, seemed irrelevant to him. His infidelities didn't count because he was a man, because he was Elvis, because the rules that applied to everyone else didn't apply to him. But Priscilla's relationship with Mike Stone was an unforgivable transgression. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. By the mid-70s, any love that had existed between them had curdled into something poisonous. Elvis began telling people in his inner circle that Priscilla was a manipulator, a user, someone who destroyed him from the inside out. He would spend hours with the Memphis Mafia, rehashing old arguments, building a narrative where he was the victim and she was the architect of his pain. These men, who depended on Elvis for their livelihoods, would listen and agree and reinforce his bitterness. They would tell him he was right to be angry, right to feel betrayed, right to believe that Priscilla had never truly loved him. Nobody challenged this narrative. Nobody suggested that maybe Elvis was being unfair or paranoid, or that both of them had contributed to the marriage's failure. Instead, they fed his resentment, and by doing so, they ensured that when Elvis finally sat down to write his will, Priscilla would be the one he blamed for everything that had gone wrong in his life. When Elvis Presley finally sat down to draft his will in the mid-1970s, he wasn't a man making casual decisions. He was a man at war with his own legacy, acutely aware that he was running out of time, and determined to control what happened to his empire after he was gone. The document that emerged from those sessions wasn't just a legal instrument designed to distribute assets. It was a statement. It was a confession. It was a weapon aimed directly at one person, the woman who'd shared his bed and his life for 14 years. The will itself is surprisingly sparse in its language when it comes to Priscilla. There's no lengthy explanation, no detailed justification for why she's being excluded. Instead, there's only a single paragraph that references certain conduct and material breaches of trust without ever specifying what those breaches actually were. This vagueness is deliberate. Elvis understood that leaving his reasoning explicit would only invite legal challenges and public debate. By keeping it vague, he made it impossible for Priscilla to directly refute his claims. She couldn't defend herself against accusations that were never fully articulated. But the document tells a much clearer story when you examine who benefits and how. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, receives a significant portion of the estate along with ongoing control of Graceland and its operations. Lisa Marie, Elvis's 9-year-old daughter, is the primary beneficiary, with her inheritance placed in a trust that will be managed until she reaches adulthood. The Memphis Mafia members the men who've lived parasitically off Elvis's generosity for years each receive cash bequests and guarantees of continued employment. It's a will designed to reward loyalty and punish what Elvis perceived as betrayal. What makes this arrangement particularly telling is how deliberate every exclusion appears to be. Elvis could have left Priscilla something symbolic, some acknowledgement of their years together or her role in giving him a child. He could have structured it so that Lisa Marie's inheritance wouldn't be diminished by any provision for her mother. But he didn't. Instead, he constructed a will that explicitly denies Priscilla any direct benefit while ensuring that everyone else in his orbit is protected and rewarded. It's the kind of surgical precision that only comes from careful planning, not spontaneous anger. The documents attached to the will, Elvis's personal notes and letters written in his own hand during 1976 and 1977, reveal just how much thought he'd put into this decision. In one handwritten note, Elvis writes about feeling robbed by Priscilla. about her attempts to position herself as my conscience and my keeper, about how she'd used their marriage as a ladder to climb out of obscurity. These aren't the ravings of a man in a drug-induced haze. They're the considered reflections of someone who's processed years of resentment and distilled them into a coherent worldview. What's particularly damning is that Elvis explicitly acknowledges in his notes that he's being vindictive. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't try to justify the exclusion on legal or practical grounds. Instead, he frames it as justice. He writes about how Priscilla received far more than she deserved during their marriage and divorce, how she attempted to manipulate and control him, and how the best gift he can give himself in death is the knowledge that she won't profit from his name or his legacy after he's gone. This is where the will becomes more than just a legal document. It becomes a final act of control, the ultimate statement from a man who'd spent his entire adult life being controlled by managers, promoters, doctors, and yes, by his wife. By disinheriting Priscilla, Elvis was reclaiming agency over the one thing that had always eluded him: his own narrative. He was saying, in the most unambiguous way possible, that his legacy would not be shaped by her, would not benefit her, and would not carry any obligation to her memory. The people closest to Elvis during this period, the Memphis Mafia members, who would later speak on record about his final months, confirmed that the will reflected his actual wishes and mindset. He discussed it with them extensively. He'd expressed his satisfaction with the exclusions. He told them that Priscilla didn't deserve anything, that she'd already taken enough, that disinheriting her was one of the few truly free decisions he'd made in years. He'd even joked darkly about how shocked she'd be when the will was read, how the reality of being cast out would finally show her the consequences of her betrayal. The timing of the will's finalization is also significant. Elvis made his last major amendments to it just months before his death, suggesting that his feelings about Priscilla hadn't softened with time. If anything, they'd intensified. He wasn't a dying man having last-minute regrets about being too harsh. He was a dying man making sure his final statement was ironclad. When Priscilla's attorneys later tried to challenge the will on the grounds that Elvis was mentally incompetent, that he was under the influence of drugs, that the Memphis Mafia had undue influence over his decisions, they ran into an unexpected problem. The very clarity of the will, the very coherence of the reasoning contained within it, worked against them. This didn't look like the work of a man whose judgment was impaired. This looked like the work of someone who'd thought very carefully about what he wanted and had executed those wishes with precision. What the legal system couldn't answer, however, was the fundamental question that haunted everyone who knew the full story. Was Elvis being fair? Was Priscilla truly guilty of the betrayals he'd accused her of? Or had he constructed a narrative that allowed him to justify treating her like an enemy? The will would never provide that answer. It would only provide the evidence of his intent, which was clear and unmistakable. Elvis Presley had looked at the woman he'd once loved and decided she deserved nothing, and he'd made sure that decision would outlive him. Everything that had gone wrong in his life. To understand why Elvis felt so completely betrayed by Priscilla, you have to understand the specific moment when everything changed between them. It wasn't a single incident, but rather a series of actions and revelations that, when taken together, convinced Elvis that the woman he'd married had been playing a role the entire time. And the evidence, documented in letters and testimonies from people who were inside Graceland during those final years, paints a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of a marriage gone wrong. The affair with Mike Stone was only the surface level of what Elvis perceived as Priscilla's betrayal. What truly devastated him was discovering that she'd been actively working against his interests while simultaneously maintaining the facade of a devoted wife. In 1971, when Priscilla had uncovered those financial documents showing Parker and Vernon's questionable dealings, Elvis initially believed she'd done it out of concern for him. But as time passed and he began reflecting on her behavior, he came to a different conclusion. She'd discovered those documents because she was systematically going through his private business affairs, learning his vulnerabilities, understanding exactly where his money was and how it was being managed. Why would she do that? Elvis believed it was because she was building a case against him. She was accumulating knowledge that could be weaponized in a divorce settlement. And when the divorce came exactly as he'd feared, she did precisely what he'd predicted. Her attorneys were ruthless, arguing that she'd sacrificed her own potential career, her own identity, her own future to support his. They positioned her as a victim who'd been used and discarded, and they leveraged that narrative to extract substantial alimony and child support payments from him. But there's another layer to this betrayal that Elvis never publicly discussed, but that haunted him privately. During their marriage, Priscilla had become intimately familiar with his deepest insecurities. She knew about his pharmaceutical dependency. She knew about his sexual dysfunction, which had become increasingly apparent as he aged and his body changed. She knew about his paranoia, his mood swings, his desperate need for validation and control. She'd been there through his most vulnerable moments, witnessing his collapse from the height of his comeback in 1968 to the bloated, sedated figure he became in the mid-70s. And then she used that knowledge. Not explicitly, not in any way that could be traced back to her directly, but through the conversation she had with people in his orbit. She'd mentioned his medication issues to his doctors, subtly suggesting that they were prescribing too much, that Elvis was becoming dependent, that something needed to change. She'd expressed concern to members of his entourage about his behavior, his mood, his ability to perform. These weren't accusations. They were observations framed as worry. But Elvis eventually realized what was happening. Priscilla was positioning herself as the only person who truly understood him, the only one who could see his problems objectively, the only one who cared enough to speak truth to him. From Elvis's perspective, she was doing exactly what she'd learned to do during their marriage, playing a role. But now the role had shifted from devoted wife to concerned ex-wife, and it gave her a kind of power over him that he found intolerable. She had access to his vulnerabilities, and she was using that access to influence the narrative about him, to position herself as the reasonable one, the caring one, the one who wasn't complicit in his self-destruction. The final straw came when Elvis discovered that Priscilla had been communicating directly with his doctors about his medications and medical condition without his knowledge or consent. She'd called Dr. Nick, his personal physician, expressing concern about the prescription cocktails Elvis was taking, suggesting that he should be on different medications, that Elvis was suffering from depression that needed psychiatric intervention. She'd positioned herself as the voice of reason, the only person who truly cared about Elvis's well-being. To Elvis, this was the ultimate violation. She'd taken the intimate knowledge she'd gained during their marriage and weaponized it against him. She was trying to control him through his own doctors, trying to shape the narrative about his mental health, trying to position herself as his savior while simultaneously profiting from the alimony he was forced to pay her. The hypocrisy, as he saw it, was staggering. She was portraying herself as concerned about his health while taking his money. She was acting like she cared about him while actively working to diminish his autonomy and control. What made this even worse, in Elvis's mind, was that it happened after their divorce. During the marriage, you could argue that she had a right to be involved in his medical care, his well-being, his life decisions, but after they'd separated, after he'd paid her settlement, after she'd moved on with Mike Stone, she had no business involving herself in his personal affairs. The fact that she continued to do so suggested that her concern had never been about love. It had always been about control. By the mid-70s, Elvis had constructed a comprehensive narrative in which Priscilla was the villain of his own story. She was the woman who'd married him for his money, who'd betrayed him for another man, who'd tried to control him through his vulnerabilities, who'd positioned herself as his conscience, while simultaneously exploiting him. And most unforgivable of all, she'd done it all while maintaining the facade of loving him, of being the devoted wife who'd sacrificed everything for his career. The will, then, becomes an act of reclamation. By excluding Priscilla entirely, Elvis was saying that he no longer accepted her version of their relationship. He was rejecting her narrative of sacrifice and devotion. He was declaring that she had no claim on his legacy, no right to profit from the name she'd borrowed and the life she'd lived through him. It was his final word in an argument that she'd won on every front during their marriage and divorce. This was the only arena left where he could have absolute control. Lisa Marie would inherit his empire because she was innocent, because she was his blood, because she represented the only truly genuine relationship he'd ever had. Vernon and the Memphis Mafia would be taken care of because they'd been loyal, because they'd supported him, because they'd never pretended to be anything other than what they were. But Priscilla would get nothing, not because Elvis hated her, but because he'd come to believe that she'd never truly been his at all. She'd been an actress playing a role, and the performance had finally ended. If this story about Elvis and Priscilla shocked you, what comes next will devastate you. There's a letter written in Elvis's own handwriting that reveals what he truly believed about her in his final days, and it's darker than anything you've heard. Subscribe now, hit that bell, and don't miss the next video. The truth is waiting,